Can you?
Hello. What a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Um, okay, everybody, it's really I'm very excited about this salon. I'm very excited to be able to finally talk to Arash. I've been wanting to do that basically for the past 12 days. It's really among the only people I've been wanting to speak to. Arash is a professor of political science and history at Clemson University. He is the author of two books on Iran, and I've put links to both of them in the chat. You can pre-order one of them and you can read the other already. And he wrote his dissertation on how the communist movement in the Middle East affected the Cold War. Is that right?
Yes, just about. Yes.
Okay. And this discussion is about, originally it was conceived as a debate or a conversation about Arash's socialism and my liberalism and how they contradict each other, how we disagree, how our worldviews differ and change the way that we prioritize and conceive of values and politics. And then, in light of recent events, we decided to kind of reframe the discussion and have it be still about the differences in our worldview, but really how those worldviews allow us to come to the kinds of crises that we're witnessing right now and organize information about them and organize how we respond to them. So I I'd like to start by asking you, Arash, how, if you find that your socialism um, gave you tools or oriented you in a way that was useful in absorbing what's been going on since October 7th, and
Yeah,
how.
yeah, absolutely. Number one, it's great to be here. I also was really looking forward to this amidst everything. And hadn't ever read so much liberal material in such a short amount of time, but it's been a pleasure. I think it's an excellent way to open the conversation because I think it absolutely has helped me orient myself not just in the last 12 days, but in general in relation to this conflict. In fact, um, uh, for a very long time, as I moved to America in 2017, as a sort of grad student, and at NYU, so center of a lot of politics in relation to Palestine and Israel, and in general in broader left, of course, everywhere, here and in Britain where I lived also before, questions of Israel and relation to Israel and Palestine are key. The For me, always a key issue here of my, you know, my position very quickly stood out for not being anti-Israel in a way that in a way that many people define themselves, and of course for me that had precisely to do with my socialism. In fact, as a socialist internationalist, the idea of being a opposed to a nation, i.e., anti a nation, is abhorrent by its nature. Of course, what Marxists have always tried to do is to bring people together across the national bounds. So the very idea that you could, in a conflict, side with one people as you will against the other, not by their goals, right? Of course, of course, in a war you can take sides, and of course you can have your goals, but to be sort of irresistibly and irreversibly against the nation as always sound preposterous and abhorrent and clearly anti-socialist to me. And the fact that this is not common should be surprising. So on October 7th, my reaction had to do with this socialist tradition in which I come from, and on October 7th, before on October 7th, and after, which is to say that the people of Israel have national rights to self-determination, like all other human beings on the planet, and so it's so I didn't so the opposition to Hamas's attacks for me I was actually frustrated that the conversation was quickly about violence and, whether violence is good and whether violence can get us somewhere. And as important as that conversation can be, for me, that was actually secondary, because it's not just the sort of violence that matters. It's that the kind of gruesome violence against civilians that you could have comes from a politics of denying any rights of existence effectively to Israeli Jews, which of course socialists, not because they're pacifists, which we are not, but because we are internationalists and because we are humanist, should have stood opposed to. So it definitely has helped me, I think, and I think it's abandonment, in fact, of any sort of this kind of universalist politics is key to the moral rot that we've seen in the last 12 days and before on the left in relation to this conflict.
When you say that it was easy for you to have been to believe that the Jews have a right to national self-determination as a socialist, but you also say that this was uncommon, in what I assume you mean was that it's uncommon in your ideological community. So was it always, were you ever in a socialist community where that interpretation was dominant, or did you come to realize that it struck you as inconsistent with the values that you and your comrades or your colleagues espoused, to be against a state just as a right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's uncommon in the Anglo-American left, right? But it's also, I mean, for me, it's also the Anglo-American left suffers from what I would say it's sort of, with no intention to use an analogy in beyond something, but I would call Philistinism, or sort of, I mean, it's a lack of a serious sort of historical approach to things, which again had been hallmark of Marxism, right? Say what you will about the communist parties, which I liked them enough to write that dissertation about. At their worst moments, they still sort of had an outlook on history, which is why even at their, by the way, it's the same reason the communist parties at their worst, they always recognized sort of Israel's right to exist, basically. They, even when they were fighting wars against Israel that really could have actually really led to Israel's destruction in some ways, and they were supportive of them, right? So of the Arab states in these wars, they always recognized, they always recognized the Communist Party of Israel, which after all was called Communist Party of Israel. It's really mattered for communists. But in the Anglo-American left, there is not a sort of consistent approach. So what you have, I guess, in lieu of a in lieu of a sort of a consistent approach, is this idea that in Israel people are divided to colonizers and colonized, from there is the short walk to then you can kill the colonizers. And this is sort of a very messy view of history, because of course, like if you want to actually consistently apply it, it's not clear what it actually means. That really does bother me, as I said, as a Marxist, because Marxists used to take their sort of theories of history very seriously. Right, so you determine something, you believe it's scientific socialism after all, right? So it's like chemistry, right? If it's scientific socialism, so you can't really change it around. And also just say something very quickly about the sort of why is it so easy for me, the idea that the Jewish Israelis are a nation and deserve a right of a nation to self-determination. They're a nation because they think they're a nation. I mean, that's the end of the question for me. I have very little interest in whether how they explain this or how they came to be to this idea. I mean, sort of Zionism. I mean, of course, I'm interested in the history of Zionism, right? But the fact of the matter, from the perspective of 2023, is that these people are a nation. Anyone who's been there, anyone who's talked to them, know that they have all the characteristics of a nation. They want to be there, and they're a national grouping. And that's really the end of the question. Even if they had all moved from Egypt 60 years ago and were under a collective amnesia that they believed that they're here, it would actually matter very little from the perspective of recognizing a right of a nation to exist and to have self-determination.
So it was consistent with your socialism to believe that Israel could exist. I mean, I also find it a strange thing when people say, do you think that Israel has a right to exist? As if like the possibility is that if I said no, it would it would stop existing, and then it's kind of the same as saying the Palestinians aren't a people. It's like, well, they say they're a people and they want to have a country, so whether you believe that they are or not really has absolutely no effect on whether or not they exist, because they say that they do. But it's one thing to believe that it should exist, it can exist, it does exist. It's quite another to believe that you have a moral imperative to care about what's happening there and to be invested in it. And I see it's very obvious to me, and I've certainly been very grateful to you for it, that you care enormously and you feel some kind of investment in the projects of both nations. So is that also an outgrowth of your socialism, or is that okay? Yeah, let's ask the question that way.
Yeah, well, so I would say, a couple of things. First of all, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, whether we like it or not, looms large in politics around the world. I personally wish it didn't in many ways. I don't think this internationalization has done either of the people good. And this is true on both sides, right? So, the fact that people in Kentucky or Connecticut march and have a strong opinions of this place on the other side of the earth, even if it's because it's their fellow Jewish people who live there, it does introduce a problematic. I unironically, I've heard people saying that they like to fight to the last drop of blood on this conflict, forgetting the fact that it's not their blood, right?
Right.
Somebody else. So it's sort of, it's a really problematic thing. So it's internationalization. So basically, if you want to be politically active, you need to have a say on this topic. But there are a couple of other reasons to care about this. First of all, I think anti-Israeliness, this sort of violent opposition to Israel, has had a corrosive effect on the left itself. It was a while back, Mona al-Tahtawi, Egyptian feminist, said something like there's an addiction in the Arab world to opposition to Israel, and she even used a stronger language. I don't remember. And Mona Tahtawi is no friend of Zionism, and she's definitely opposed the Israeli state in many ways, but she recognized something that's very important, which was that this opposition is doing something bad to these societies themselves, and is also doing it to the left itself. I mean, the very bizarre fact that what position Britain would have on Israel was a sort of a major thing in excluding a left movement in the British Labour Party. The bizarre fact that in the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, we have a faction called anti-Zionist, as it's not just on this issue, right? But that this is its entire sort of identity. I just find that bizarre, basically. I mean, it's like we don't do that with Kashmir, and we don't do that with Tibet. So I think it has a corrosive effect. And that, last but not least, let's say, of course, I think the question of nationalism, it's important. I think it's one of the sort of blind spots of the left. The left is uncomfortable with nations. I would say it's uncomfortable with with national sovereignty. And I think in your article, in A Liberal Zion, you sort of speak about liberal nationalism as an ideal and as something sort of that you counterpose to blood and soil tribalism and vapid cosmopolitanism. And I think that's spot on. As a socialist, I would say, as a socialist internationalist, very much a cosmopolitan, I would say liberal nationalism is definitely necessary to use a good Marxist language in this stage of human progress, right? I would be very glad if people were willing enthusiastically to give up their national states and join a global community, but they're not. So long as we need to have some tribal connections, better for it to be this liberal nationalism. And everyone hates nations, right? The most common sort of liberal to left, in academia and everywhere, is to say, hate nations are sort of gross, right? They're even associated with fascism. I think that's very misleading. That's why I take the question of nationalism seriously. And if you take it seriously in case of Israel and Palestine, you'll realize that you're going to need to have this, you're going to need to take respect, if you will, the sovereignty and national rights for both of these communities, one of which, of course, has been denied this right for for its entire existence in the past few decades.
Right. I mean, the essential to its identity is that it has been denied this right. So I think that there are a couple of things you said that I just want to I want to emphasize. I so agree with you that the way that the conflict is covered is so disastrous to the conflict. And I mean, right now we're having this is like the most overt example of this feeling, or this effect that I've ever lived through. Like the way that the left responded to October 7th and the fallout from that response is happening at the same time as Gaza is besieged and the number of civilian deaths approaches 4,000. So both of those things are happening at the same time, and they're not, like, as a liberal, they demand different responses from me. And in fact, I mean, they're not contradictory responses, but they certainly feel contradictory in me, because I have to do two things at the same time. I have to say this was wrong and also this was wrong. And so I am, in the lonely place, which is like telling the left, or the extremes of the left, that the way that they've responded is inhuman, while also telling Israel, which is like allied with the global right in a way that is so disastrous for everyone, that this cannot be, like, any liberal Zionist cannot countenance this kind of warfare. So it resonates with me very deeply to have these, like, when you say that, okay, fine, I'm a socialist, and do I want everybody to join a global community? Of course I do, but that's never going to work. So I have to ally myself with movements that are
not just yet.
Not yet.
One
No,
day,
right. Sorry.
one day.
Like messianic. Yeah, it does feel it's interesting. And I want to talk to you about how both of our ideologies respond to, or how our religious backgrounds. Were you raised religious? Did you grow up in a religious family?
Not really, not my immediate family. Although my, my grandmother was and is a very religious. One of my grandmothers, very religious, devout Shia Muslim. And I didn't have a lot of Muslims, but I had a few. When my prayers didn't work and Iran still didn't qualify to the World Cup in 2002, I really lost faith in God then. It hasn't really turned back then. So if only Iran had defeated Ireland in that game and we'd made it to the World Cup, I might have been more religious.
Were you a socialist before you stopped being religious, or
I was always a socialist as long as I remember, and I would say that I had some religious tendencies, and I mean, no, I'm an atheist now, but I would say that I'm not anti-religion in a way that's very common in Iran. But it's not actually that common on the left here, I guess, but in Iran it's very common to be very anti-religion. I think I kind of find that a little silly, actually, almost, because they, it's sort of you have a scapegoat called religion that is very actually hard. If you want to talk to people a little bit, like, this religion that you hate, what is it exactly? They can hardly have a definition of it. Certainly religion has no, sort of bigotry and intolerance is no exclusive reserves of religious people. At any rate, but yes, I remain very interested in religion, despite being kind of sure, as much as one can be, that there's no almighty.
Right. I mean, because of my upbringing, so because of my upbringing, I feel a tribal loyalty to the Jewish people, to Israel. I mean, I'm tempted towards tribalism, and I think that is very useful to me, because it allows me, like, the kind of liberal that I trust the most, and the kind that I think is best prepared to be motivated towards the good, is the kind that uses their liberalism to kind of constrain or strangle a tribalism they feel very drawn to. So, for example, in this conflict, the fact that I was the horror and pain that I experienced on October 7th and the subsequent days was very important to me as a liberal, because it allowed me to recognize the pain that I know Palestinians who are not in Gaza must be feeling right now. And we're not going to have a like conversation about which is worse, because that would be grotesque. But I knew while it was happening that, I mean, it felt like, you know, it felt like it was just terrible pain. I mean, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could do nothing but scroll constant. It was just, you know, kind of a not human place. And I knew while it was happening that there was going to be retaliation, and the retaliation was going to be horrible. And so I wanted to like prepare myself for the time when I wasn't going to be the only one feeling this way. And the reason that I have those kinds of associations and loyalties is because of my upbringing. Do you have similar tribal tendencies? And do you feel both of our ideologies are universalist? I mean, liberalism also has universal aspirations, obviously. So do you have an analogous movement?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. And let me explain. I think it's a fascinating conversation. And it's interesting that you sort of linked your tribalism to religion, of course, because you, of course, come from that particular identity of Jewish, which has this link between religion and identity in that way. Of course, as we all know, there's also, I mean, for me, that's what identity, you know, a strong affinity with the Jewish people is the best definition of Jewishness that I know of, even for those who might be very irreligious. And in fact, that's sort of fascinating. I mean, you know, Eric Hobsbawm sort of has a famous sort of, you know, they ask him about being Jewish and what it meant to him. Clearly, you know, culturally, he was sort of a British guy born in Alexandria. Religiously, he was an atheist. Politically, he was a communist. So, you know, none of this really fit the Jewishness. But I mean, he says, you know, they never let you forget. And of course, he and of course he sort of held to that. So that's, I mean, I think the Jewish identity is fascinating in this way. But I have my own tribal identities, and I'll tell you how I square them with the what we've seen since October 7, and also with our universalism. So my tribal identity, which is you know, not so tribal in some ways, is Iranianness. You know, I consider myself an Iranian patriot. You know, I love my country, and I love my people, and I identify with them. I consider it an immense privilege to be Iranian, frankly. And it's sort of hard to explain sometimes. You know, I remember there was a test sort of about political compass, and you know, one of the questions there is an idea, they agree or disagree, like that's, it's sort of silly to believe it's silly to believe, to be proud of being from your nation because you don't choose it, right? And supposedly the good progressive answer was to say, oh, obviously this is a true statement, but I don't agree, because we humans are limited. You and I both can, at this ripe age of, you know, mid-30s and stuff like that, we can all try to we can all try to learn Finnish and read Finnish poetry, but we probably won't. Right? There's, no matter how much cosmopolitan things we follow, there would be a few things. And Iranianness is something instilled in me that I grew up with, and it's a community that I'm very proud to belong to. You know, I don't know what better privilege there is that my mother tongue is that of Hafiz and Khayyam and Sadi, and I can read them. Something that no one will have. You know, you will not never have, even if you learn Persian, because it wouldn't be your mother tongue, and you wouldn't learn in the same way. So I do have a great tribalist instinct. I think if it was 1980 and Iran was attacked by Iraq, you know, I would proudly fight to defend my country. You know, so I do have that. But I think the interesting thing about universalism that comes to it is, of course, an idea that, okay, we need to recognize that all people have identities that is dear to them. And so how can we have a world in which we are free to, and this is why I'm interested in your idea of liberal nationalism, right? How can we have a world in which we are able to follow these identities? And, you know, nationalism gets a lot of bad rep, and terrible things happen in 20th century in relation to it. But let's face it, terrible things happen in 20th century in relation to everything, right? Millions were killed under universalist ideologies as well, and we shouldn't forget that. But my wife is a citizen of Turkey, with a very varied ethnography. She's, partially Italian, partially Polish, partially Arab. And Turkey has this terrible homogenizing history of nationalism, right? That's really suppressed. It's sort of one of the most grotesquely homogenizing nationalism. And yet, in nationalism in Turkey, I see something beautiful, which is the creation of a national community. And the yes is connected by the Turkish language. All those Kurdish people who fight so bravely for recognition of, let's say, Armenian genocide and for their own linguistic rights like Kurds, do so as part of a Turkey elite, to use the term there, right? Separate from being a Turk, like Turkey-wide national community. So I think nationalism gets a lot of bad rep, but actually a modern liberal civic nation state has a sort of an excellent way of including people and of letting them practice their identities in the varied ways that they are. The question that I have for you, though, if I may return the table on you, and in relation to your article, is that I hate this term devil's advocate, but a counterpoint to this, what worries me is that is this vision of liberal nationalism that we have a fantasy? Actually, are we, so long as we have a nation named after Turkey, and today, ultra nationalists represent, vast majority of Turkish parliament, for example. In Israel, we see, of course, fascist and different sort of ultra nationalists in power, and in many other countries. So my fear is that with our attempt to be liberal nationalists, are we following a fantasy and meanwhile just being handmaiden to ethno-nationalism that always will have a tendency to become exclusionary, as we see in India and Israel and Turkey, as I said. Is this a danger that you think about, or no? Is it forever a struggle, and that we can always fight for more inclusive forms of nationalism?
I think that in Israel, it will be a forever struggle. I don't think that it's possible. I mean, it's very bad now. It's very bad right now. It was very bad, 3 weeks ago. It's very bad right now. And it will probably be worse when this is all over. We'll see. We'll see what happens. And I honestly, I feel foolish about everybody. Every time I get like a hot take on what's going to happen in Israeli politics after this is all over, at first I kind of feel a little dirty that I'm even thinking about that. And then I feel like this is ridiculous that anyone could think that they could possibly know. But Israel is so small and made up of so many different types of citizens and in such a contentious part of the world that I think the idea that there ever would be a healthily functioning liberal state where, major battles didn't have to be constantly fought, not in my lifetime. I hope that in my lifetime there is a two-state solution. I hope that, we can achieve that much in my lifetime. But even if it was just a Jewish state, I mean, the problems amongst the Jews in a Jewish state are enormous. And not because we're naturally litigious people. It's just like, insane. And that's mostly what the protest movement that began in Israel on January 7th of this past year was largely about intra-Jewish problems. So I don't believe that the thing that I'm hoping for is perfect liberalism. There is no such thing. There never has been. And you can give examples of some countries that have it. I do think it's always asymptotic. I think Israel is going to be like, it's never going to even get to asymptotic. It's always going to be very far away. But I do believe that it is the only kind of moral orientation that allows me to push for educate myself in preparation for, and then push for a more moral Israel. I think it's the only way that that direction is the only good direction. And I think that about America also, by the way.
Well,
does that answer the question?
Let's not open that can of worms. No, no, I agree with you. I think the way I would put it is, the thing that people, so actually now that you brought America, it's an interesting thing. I've heard a number of Americans very genuinely say, why should we have a state that has any sort of Jewishness in it, when in America, if you had a state that, that was dedicated to, let's say, white people, that would be like considered fascist, right? So how can you have a state that's the comparison they make. Of course, it makes it's a perfect comparison if you only know two states in the world, right? So you're like, which is often true with Americans, right? So they're like, oh, well, why can't Israel just be a sort of federal republic like the United States? Of course, the United States is particular. It has its own history, has its own history of genocide, has own history of whiteness, of blackness, of minority rights, and the fact that it's a continental-wide power, the fact that it has been a superpower for much of its recent history. All of these things makes it different. But I think the question is this: what can the state rule in the name of, right? The actually existing states. And we don't have some tabula rasa here. It's not like we're not playing some civilization game where we can divide it. I read old journals when they were saying, it would be great if Yugoslavia was divided based on sort of river cantons instead of ethnic states. It would have been great, but it's not what actually happened. So the question, what would it be good to have a state in the name of? Here's where I think liberal nationalism, it's a pretty reasonable answer, because you say, look, the state is going to be, with the sort of progression of humanity as it has come, right? The state has to be a couple of things. First of all, it has to have, as you say in your article, there's always a minority. So the concept of minority rights needs to be strong, and equal citizenship for everyone who is there, tied to birth and stuff. But there will always be a secondary thing, and which is that, the state will have some titular nationality, i.e. it would be linked, many states, not all of them, will be linked to a titular nationality. After all, that's what the Bulgarian state is for. It's for Bulgarians, right? And for Israel, I believe it is possible for Israel to be both a Jewish state and a state of all of its citizens, as the conversation in that country goes. And of course, for Palestinians to have their own state. And I should say here on the whole one state, two state discussion, if currently two national communities, in fact, two states exist, Israel and Palestine, one of them occupied by the other largely. But if the people of these states wanted to join together, I will be in the first row cheering it on. But there doesn't seem to be any such any such tendency. And frankly, if we were going to join, I would also like India and Pakistan to undo the partition and join each other and have United States. However, I don't see that as a workability. So long as we don't have that, what we can have is to fight for states to be more inclusive, and for them to have equal rights for everyone, and for them to have these liberal commitments that I think both of us care about. And frankly, also to remember that, to strengthen these states actually against, this is the other thing, a leftist agenda should want to give some power to the states and political communities against a lot of transnational processes that are heavily anti-democratic, right? Against tech. So I don't know why people won't think about that more, right? Against let's say, as I said, the dominance of a few small multinational tech companies, right? So for me, a leftist agenda should be patriotic. Patriotism, it should go fit hand in glove with a good leftist agenda, and yet, unfortunately, it's all but disappeared from the left in Anglo world and in most places, I would say.
Right. Do you think that, if there was any desire on behalf of both people to have one state, it wouldn't matter whether it was a Jewish state or an Arab state or a Muslim state, if those people decided that it didn't matter to them. Do you think that the common left response to opposition to the state of Israel is because they believe that a Jewish state is more likely to impose Jewish structures on an unwilling population than, say, another, like a Muslim state?
Well, so you're asking me what do I think accounts for the position of most people on sort of on the left in America, I guess. Look,
Yeah.
I'm gonna be honest, and I really don't mean no disrespect to anyone, but I really think when I talk to the degree that I talk to a lot of people, I don't think they basically are consistent about it, or they think very carefully about it. I think a lot of them are, they see the fact, and it is a fact. The Israeli state has done a lot of terrible things. It's the only state in the world to occupy another people in a nation like this for decades. No other state does this in the world now, right? No matter what horror China has done to its people, it doesn't rule over millions of people who are not its citizens. So the Israeli state does do this. But the way that people are obsessed about it, or the way they want to offer solutions to it, I don't think it's really consistent. And I think it's based on but what do I mean when I say it's not consistent? Let me explain what I mean. I mean that they have they have an ideology around it that fits Israel, for example, about colonizer, colonized, right? But they're not, for me, it's very important. If I have an ideological approach to something, the question is, well, how will it fit anywhere else, right? And if it didn't, then that's obviously sort of a problem. So I think this is the issue here. I think they don't do that, right?
Yeah.
I think they'll tell themselves, okay, if Jewish people who were born, I mean, this guy, and I don't even want to name on some like frenzied state in sort of a podcast a couple of days ago, talking about how these people who were partying are settlers living on a stolen land, and I guess that means, I mean, not I guess, he basically was saying when they're killed by Hamas, maybe that's okay.
Yeah.
The key fact here is that, okay, let's accept that as your moral universe, but then who else is included in that? How many generations do we go back? What does that even really mean, right? So they don't engage in these questions in any depth, and that's sort of what is frustrating, right? They don't really engage in this question in depth, or talk about what it would mean if applied to other places, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think the Jewish state, like Israel, is a fairly common ethnic-based national state, like others. The things that makes it very unique is because the Jewish people are rather unique, right? They were handed a unique history, right? So the reason that Israel is not just like Bulgaria has to do with this for me. And I think to the struggles there are very normal. So in another word, I'm anti-exceptionalist when it comes to Israel-Palestine. Nothing about this conflict for me is very exceptional. It's very ordinary. It's very sort of reminiscent of all other sort of ethno-national conflicts that have happened in the world. And frankly, here's another crazy thing for you. I basically think it's not a very hard one to solve. And I think we're actually in the midst of solving. I am one of those who believes very small political events in the different capitals in the last 10, 15 years could have solved this conflict already. By solved, which I mean a two-state solution, and then Israel would be a state, and people like you and I are intellectuals. We could forever have conversations about, what does its Jewishness mean, and what does its citizenship mean, and all that. But for most people, they're living their lives as citizens of two states, and they'll hate each other or love each other, or some of them, but it would be sort of mundane and ordinary. So I don't think there's this intractability to.
Yeah.
And of course, I love it when they say, well, it's gone on for so many years. Of course, as a historian, 50, 60 years is nothing,
Right.
In the longer durée, it's nothing. So I don't think it's intractable at all, which is a hopeful place to be, especially when we're in the midst of abyss at this moment.
Right. I think that something that helps me orient myself when having conversations with people about this subject, people who really don't know anything, usually the people who don't know anything are better to talk to than the people who know a little bit, because usually if they know a little bit, they only know a little bit. Like there are lots of talking points on both sides that are true. And so if you're talking to a person who only knows half of them, it's like they think that they know everything that they need to know about the conflict. But for people on the other side, they don't. Right. So when I'm talking to people now, like right now, because I find that the most people who reach out to me now, and are like, asking me questions about the conflict, are doing that because they don't know what to think at all. Are you experiencing that at all?
Yeah, I think I think so, and especially because they're forced to sort of think. There's a sort of a, I have to say, there's a bit of a blackmail attitude on partisans, sometimes partisans on both sides actually sort of say, you have to take a position, and a lot of people are experience a lot of anguish about that, right?
Yeah.
But I think it would be I think it would be unfair to say, or perhaps it wouldn't be the best response to say, well, maybe not everybody should have a position. My universalistic, my dream society is one in which at the breakfast table, everyone talks about the elections in, Papua New Guinea and has a position on them. Certainly that's how it works in my household with my wife. So I think it's a good position. I think Israel-Palestine and the sort of intractable emotions around it, it's a good opportunity to say, okay, what is your worldview, right? And how do you approach these things, right? On the question of boycott of Israel, I mean, this is a very interesting one, right? It used to be at better times when we just had debates about whether you boycott something or not. I would always ask, okay, if you boycott, and no one actually has an answer to this, by the way, no one actually has a morally consistent answer, is that, okay, you boycott, what is your conception of badness in the world in which the Jerusalem Film Festival should be boycotted, but all other film festivals in, let's say, China or Russia or Iran or other places shouldn't be? And there's no easy to give an answer. The lazy answer is usually something like, well, Palestinians ask us to do this. If anybody else asks us to do this, we'll do it, which is a silly thing to say, because of course, it's, some people ask you to do a lot of things, right? You need to do things out of sort of a moral consistency. So anyways, I think it's a good, we started this conversation by saying, how our respective universalist ideologies leads us on how to orient to this, and I think it's a good test for people to have. It's like, what kind of a worldview you have.
Right.
Yeah, and there's some questions on the chat, so would you like?
Sure, absolutely.
You're the boss here, but I saw it first.
Did you see the question?
Yes. Shall I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so Philip Belcher, so I won't read the question again because I guess everyone can see it. It's about how monotheistic regions are by nature exclusive, and how to believe things in the others are inferior, must therefore change. They have to be saved from something. Yes. So I mean, that's why I think secularism really matters, by which I mean that the state shouldn't be religious. And I think one of the greatest problematics of Israel will always be, how can it be a Jewish state without it being a theocratic state? And I think Israelis really need to understand the danger of it. I think this is enough that I wrote an article for Yehudit Achronot, published in both Hebrew and English, on this very topic, as an Iranian who grew up under theocracy, as a warning to Jews that, hey guys, basically, it's not nice getting a theocratic state. Yeah, so I think this goes early on to the Israeli state. I think one of the first decisions made by Ben Gurion and co, who are of course mostly very non-religious,
right.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of powers they gave to the rabbinate authorities, I think I think were a mistake, frankly, and I think they're problematics to the Jewish state. But it will, I mean, as you said, it would be a subject of and debate always. I think it will I think it will always be, but also, if you remember, if you're talking about the neighborhood, the Middle East, Islam is baked into constitutions of almost every state in the Middle East, although none of them are really theocratic, except for Iran. So I think it's a problematic everywhere. But I think, yes, a principle of secularism is that there shouldn't be this marriage. But as I said, I don't think the fact of it being a Jewish state, which after all, what does it mean? It just means that it says that it's a Jewish state, doesn't need to mean these theocratic things. I mean, I think many Israelis would like to be able to get married to their own country, in their own country, instead of flying to Cyprus because they don't check on the list of the checklist of the rabbis. So yeah, so that's what I think on that question.
I mean, I think Israel is a really good like case test for, or like a kind of microcosm of all the problems that we have when we talk about socialism and liberalism and theocracy, because it started out as a socialist country, but it started out as a socialist country that depended on, like, the fact Israel was founded by socialists, by Jewish socialists, but the fact that it was able to be founded was a product of the yearning for Jerusalem that Jews had felt for such a long time. And so there were Jews who had felt so tied to the land that they had moved back there before the founding of the state. If that hadn't happened, there wouldn't be a state now. And it was always the universal tendencies within Israeli society are always tempered by a ferocious tribalism that is inconsistent but always acts in tandem. So now there are more secular Israelis than there are any other kind of Israeli. There always have been, but the religious right in Israel is incredibly politically powerful, right? So Bibi won with a slim minority, with a slim plurality, majority, whatever, of the electorate, and was able to like get together a cabinet that is really not representative at all of the Israeli of total demographics of the whole population, because the people who are most dependable and powerful politically, like the electorates that are really going to use the little muscle that they have, are religious. So they're always going to be in tension with each other, and I think that that's probably true. I know most about Israel and the way that its liberalism is tempered by or completely dominated by tribal tendencies, but I would imagine that this is true in other countries, other similar countries also, that most people aren't religious, or most people aren't whatever the dominant thing is, but the people that are the dominant thing are much more easy to manipulate politically and much more likely to turn out regularly. And this gets me to a question that I wanted to ask you about, Arash, about the power that socialism has to organize people. Because I think that I'm a liberal because I was raised in an incredibly kind of top-down authoritarian religious community, and I really didn't like it. And so I'm distrustful of authority. And liberalism is distrustful of authority. Or I think at least the kind of liberalism that I practice and adhere to, sort of like Shklarian liberalism of fear. And I think that the reason it functions the way that it does is because it is always not going to trust the government. It's not going to trust people in uniform, which I think is a good thing, largely in that it like is the reason why it is committed to protecting individual freedom. It's very bad at community organizing. So it's very good at like identifying the rights that need to be protected, and very bad at actually protecting them. Whereas I think socialism does it the opposite way.
So yeah, number one, I should say, as someone who grew up in the Islamic Republic of Iran, I like your Shakespearean and liberalism of fear. I think wanting to make sure that, you know, someone can't knock on your door and take you away, and making sure that that never happens, it's a very noble thing. And I adhere to it, you know, for the simple reason that I have been in many rooms when people in uniform have come, knocked on the door, and took me away and took others away, right? So, it's something that, habeas corpus, I love it, for this, for this reason. It's funny, as you know, habeas corpus means I have the body. So many days, me and my comrades have been searching to find out who has the body, for days on end sometimes. So, so it's something that I hold very dear. And let me also tell you this. So I'll answer about socialism and sort of its organizing capacity. It makes me depressed, honestly, personally, of how little a lot of the left regard it has for liberal democracy and for these basic rights. Now, I think, and these competitions always become sort of silly. Oh, are you punching the left? Are you exaggerating it? Or that Trump is a real threat? Sure, of course, I believe Trump is a real threat. But I also do know that illiberal socialist states in 20th century killed millions of people. And I do know that I do believe that a lot of my comrades on the left, genuinely, they think this is bourgeois democracy. It doesn't matter. Supreme Court is bullshit. They really do. They don't have commitment to this stuff. And I think it's partially because they really, I know it's sort of a lazy answer, but they don't really know what it means to have a state that that can rule you. And I find that very dangerous, because I think liberalism is under serious threat. Its basic liberal rights are under serious threat from both right and the left. And it's possible that they would be buried, as they were in the 1930s. Now, as for the question of organizing. It's very interesting, actually. I should put it as a challenge to you. Why is it, if you're so committed to this Shecklerian liberalism of fear, why is it that you don't think you can organize others on that basis and say, surely this commitment to this, can itself be bring people together? So I think, it shouldn't be, and I think it's a problematic for liberalism. I like to think deeply about it also, to its history, if you will, of how how it has often sort of been in a minority, but at the same time, liberal commitments really became central to a lot of socialist politics in Europe, right? So the social democratic parties became really committed to liberalism, especially after the Cold War. And I think that's an interesting process we haven't perhaps studied as much, right? Because it's known that socialists kind of replaced liberalism as the main center-left party, but they also they sort of absorbed this liberalism. And of course, I would also say that for a lot of liberals, and of course, I was reading Samuel Moyn's book as well about Cold War liberalism before in relation to all of this, and not to sort of make a direct reference to it, but I think it's fair to say that liberals who are very comfortable with the invisible hand of the market and capitalism and neoliberalism, to use that term in quotations, actually they are also sort of losing some of their commitment to big authority. Because if Walmart can decide everything about your fate, that's not that's not very liberal. And there have been, of course, readings of Sheckler from the left. Was it Junio Gatti, right, has that famous book, and there are critiques of it that perhaps it goes too much. But yeah, so I think my final conclusion here is that in organizing around a vision for a better world should be possible, even if you're worried about authority. They should see that coming together of people. It's sort of a contradiction here, right? And I can tell you about Iran, my experience, right? What is the one weapon we have against the state that comes after us? Our community, right? We know that there's someone we can call, a human rights lawyer, right? So it's like you have to have commonalities. I'm very Hobbesian in my own way. I was really afraid of sort of state authority, but you have to remember that human beings are social, and we need to sort of come together. And the other thing I'd say lastly is that there can be a productive, as this conversation has been, a give and take between liberals and socialists, that we can understand that we actually do share a lot in common when you really think about it. And after all, we came together in the Second World War to defeat fascism, as I like to say. So we should really think of that again as the fascism and other sort of, I would say, other sort of big brothers really do threaten all of us and all of our rights.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say, I think that the fact that conversations like these are possible, I think that they're necessary to liberalism. I think that liberalism depends on being able to ally itself with groups that are better at organizing than they are, or rather, what I really mean is that it needs, because what liberalism can do is facilitate a state in which people are free to practice as they will and form communities as they will. And what liberalism has to do is constrain the state in a, it's motion censored. So if I don't move for long enough, then it turns off. That it was a bad time for it to go black. Like if what liberalism should do and can do is constrain the authorities that are going to like impose values or impose practice on its people. But if it's going to do that, then if it's going to give communities the freedom to be able to function as they want to, it also has to bolster those communities and ally themselves with those communities so that they're best positioned to secure the rights of all of those minority communities. It has to be invested in that. Which is why I do think that, like, as a liberal, I need to care deeply about minority rights in my state, but also in states that aren't mine. And then the question is, like, if you believe that and you are a universalist, how do you triage which ones you actually speak up about and which ones you have opinions about? So yes, I think all of that is, I think that all of that is important and good, and I think that this conversation is not just like a nice thing that we were able to do, but a necessary thing. As a liberal, I must believe that it is a necessary thing that we were able to do. Okay. thus ends like the segment of the salon that was just me and Arash, although I would really love if people had questions that they would ask them now. So if you know how to like raise your hand, you could raise your hand and I'll call on you. If you prefer not to do that, then you could just type it in the chat box. But yes, let's move to that segment of the. Okay, Chuang, please unmute yourself. You're muted.
Okay. Thank you again, Celeste, Arash, for the wonderful dialogue. My question was inspired by a rather unpleasant experience with a fellow university student about the topic of Israel and Palestine. I took on the side of Israel, simply put, and she took on the anti-Israel side. Dialogue broke down soon afterwards. And so I wonder, how do you talk to people who holds these very intense feelings about this particular conflict? How do you get them to not just understand your viewpoint, but to sympathize with it, and also you on the other side as well, paying in the same courtesy?
Arash, you want to go first?
Sure. Although I'm sure you're more capable of creating sympathy on other people, but I'll try. Look, I mean, what I try to do is to tell them that, look, it's actually, the answer is universalism. It's to say, look, I'm an Iranian Shia Muslim. I have a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian people, number one, on a basic sort of tribal cultural level. When I was in Israel and in Palestine, I see these Palestinians, I see them in them my grandmother, I see in them my grandfather. I mean, I was talking to people in Jerusalem. We have something in common. Their names speak to me, even though they're Arabic and I'm Persian, but they are I'm part of the sort of Muslim culture. So I have that sympathy, and I have sympathy because of the struggle that they've had, because of their statelessness, because of the occupation, because of the siege, right? I have all of those. But at the same time, I also have a universalistic outlook in the world, which means that I don't see ethnic conflicts as football games where you take one side over the other, right? And that I will have an outlook, and I will try to explain to them, look, this is what I think. This is what I think Israelis deserve. This is what I think Palestinians deserve. And it's because of this broader outlook I have. And if I wanted to throw that out, then I would have to throw a lot of other things out, right? And that's sort of when it gets interesting, right? Because the question is, if you think it's, specifics matter. If you think it's okay to kill Israeli civilians, who else do you think is okay to kill? Right? It really raises that question. And I've never really heard as I said, convincing answer from people. There was this weird genre on Twitter of people saying, as Americans, it's okay if a Cherokee person killed me here because I'm a settler. But it's sort of a abyss of Twitter say nothingism, right? I would think a patient explanation of your position and whether its moral roots can do a lot. Having in mind that a lot of people would not, of course, would not be convinced, and would also not speak even directly to your point. And that also is very fraught, because it's of course not just talking about one thing. You have to always be careful what you're saying, and then your intentions would always be misjudged, and you also yourself, you have to see if you're truly acting on the basis of some principle, or are you just giving in to some sort of other sort of prejudice that you might have, or sympathy. So, and I think it's both for orienting oneself and for discussing with others is important to sort of have that principled conversation on a universalist basis.
Yeah. I mean, what I find in conversations on this subject, and people do get mad at me a lot, and I do feel like if I'm getting yelled at by somebody on the left and somebody on the right at least once a day since this conflict started, I find that very reassuring. It's like the only reassurance that I want right now, aside from Arash agreeing with me. But I think that the thing that I depend on is like, I make sure never to, or I try very, very hard not to say anything about things I know nothing about. And the temptation is very strong to say things that I don't know anything about. And sometimes I mess up, I realized today that I had told somebody that Hamas agreed that they would give over all of the hostages safely if Israel agreed to a ceasefire. And I told somebody that before I had confirmed that that was true. And so regardless of whether or not I think they should do that, whether or not I think they really would do that, whatever, like I just realized that I had said something that I wasn't sure. I had heard it from somebody that I trusted, but anyway, like I didn't check the source. And it's very important if you're going to talk publicly about this issue, or even if you're going to talk privately, but with somebody that you're trying to persuade, it's very important that you don't say anything about something that you don't know is right. And you can definitely, a really great way to earn people's trust is to say, I don't know. Because then they assume that the other things that you're saying you do know.
You only talk about things you know about. As a man, this is very difficult for me, but I agree.
I wish I was that. And the other thing that I find very useful, and like I cannot believe how many times it has worked since this last conflagration started. If you get yelled at by somebody who is disagreeing with whatever perspective you seem to be espousing at the time, it is very useful to say to them, you are being inhuman to me. And also I have the receipts of all the times that I have genuinely heartfeltly expressed real sincere care for the side you think I don't care about. And because it costs people so much to say anything about the other side on this issue, if you have publicly and sincerely expressed concern for the other side, and by the way, there is no position of any integrity, there is not a one that doesn't include serious concern for human beings on both sides, because no matter what, unless you are completely insane, you know that innocent people are being killed. So it should not be difficult, although it is very difficult, like objectively, it should not be difficult to care about both people. I don't find that difficult. I find it difficult to express it in an intelligent way all the time, but I have found that if I can say to somebody who has said something that is like out of anger or out of distrust, if I can say to them, like, I really do care about the people you think I care nothing about, so many people have apologized to me and like retracted the thing that they've said. So I think disarming people by talking about this subject as if it's actually involves human beings is a really great way to get people to have a human conversation with you about it. Are there any other questions for us? Yes, Carl Scheingold, please. You are on mute. Ask to unmute.
How's that?
That's perfect. Thank you.
I should quit while I'm ahead, but I will say something. The idea of a dialogue between liberalism and socialism is very intriguing to me. It has been for a long time. And this whole conversation is a wonderful example of something that, if framed on a different issue at a different time, different people talking, it would have been a rousing debate. You can imagine those topics. But this was not, and I ask myself as I've been listening, why? And it strikes me that if the socialism we're talking about is based on a serious intellectual dealing with Marxism, source of Marxism, using Marxism in an intellectually serious way, then liberalism and socialism have a lot in common, in a sense that they're both built on dealing seriously with complexity, with contradictions, not being utopian in that sense. Used to dealing, whether it's universalism, particularism, taking both seriously. Liberals always have to take two things seriously. That's one of the reasons they have trouble organizing, because it seems too complicated for other people. And a serious Marxist analysis has a similar quality to it. And so I guess it's not a comment more than a question, but I'm excited by the possibility of dialogue between positions that are not utopian, that deal with complexity, that take both sides seriously, but aren't passive in response to that. or overwhelmed by the complexity, but try to push forward in some way. I guess I wanted to say thank you. I think this was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carl. Heather, you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to turn my video on. Yeah, I agree. Thank you for the conversation. It's been really great. My question has to do in part with what you just said about kind of not saying anything if you don't truly understand what's going on. My Uncle Bobby used to say, never give up an opportunity to keep your mouth shut. That was, rules that he lived by. And I think about that a lot right now. I think a lot of organizations, whether they are political or non-political or apolitical, are being pushed by their constituencies, which may involve multiple different kind of views and things, to say something. You have to say something, the sort of like silence is violence crowd or what have you. And I know lots of people throughout my, professional and social networks who don't agree on this issue and like reasonably don't agree on this issue. At the same time, having been in New York during 9/11, my first thought after, oh my God, this is awful, and look at all those people who died, was the retribution for this is going to be terrible, and like we're going to lose more innocent people because of whatever way the United States is feeling right now about this. So I kind of get it from an emotional level, but the people, which is most of us, who don't have a fine-tuned understanding of what it is that's going on over there, that must rely on great conversations like these. And again, thank you very much for kind of helping add some intellectual and philosophical context to the current situation. But I guess I'm wondering what advice you would give to people at all kinds of organizations who are being forced to say something when it's A, not their area of domain, and B, something that's you're going to be devoured from both sides no matter what you do, and C, might not be based on a true understanding of what is happening or what is at stake.
Yeah.
Arash,
please.
Thank you very much. This is a great intervention, and I love that you use this frame that people use, this phrase that people use, silence is violence. I mean, it's such a sort of a silly thing to say, because number one, no, silence is not violence. It's like, what does that even mean, right? So everybody has to talk about everything all the time. This is sort of, as I said, sort of moral blackmailing, that if you don't, and of course, silence, you all also have to say exactly what they want, and of course, one has some sympathy to this, right? To this position, one would say, there are times in which, of course, if you're silent about something that's really have a direct effect on you, it's sort of you're complicit in it. And I like the idea of active citizenry, I guess, like one would have in both liberalism and socialism, that that it's good for people to be acquaint themselves with issues and speak on them. But this is the impulse of the whole silence is violence, is not one of an active citizenry who thinks about things for themselves, and it's to say, you have to join these narratives that are so sort of, the age of memification also. They make these little memes about things, the texts that are just so silly on things. There's always that, I don't know if you received that meme of the, like, there are two silhouettes of women sitting each other and having tea, and they're asking questions about each other. It's a perfect thing for sort of how silly it is, because it's like framed in such a non-intelligent way. You can read great historians of Palestine like Rashid Khalidi and others who take very seriously, the opposite side. Rashid Khalidi was a sort of a great partisan of the Palestinian cause and a historian of it, but he doesn't make a joke of what the other side wants, whereas people in these conditions do on both sides, I have to say, sort of extreme partisans of both sides do. So I think one has to basically resist that impulse and to say, no, I don't have to sort of issue an immediate opinion on things all the time. B, not everyone is, especially in a topic as fraught as this, not everyone should be forced to do the kind of public position taking that I do, and that maybe Celeste does. Like, not everyone should be forced. I have sort of paid the terrible social prices for taking the positions that I did, and not everyone should be forced to do that, frankly. And the people like me who are political activists and are loudmouths and it's like talk everywhere, the world would be a bleak place if everyone had the sort of same sensibility and personality. It's great for some people who want to be more thoughtful, think about something, and I think we should really resist that impulse. And it's not just about Israel-Palestine, on other issues as well. And let me just also say that the impulse, what it results in is not people becoming very actively knowledgeable about something. It becomes into them becoming mouthpieces of others effectively, and this memification culture. So you just declare something, you just post something, and without being able to really engage in it, because you were not driven into it based on a sort of genuine moral impulse, but by a moral blackmail and worse, sort of trying to fit in with a crowd by posting one thing or the other. So I think we should sort of, as a good socialist, as you say, I'd like to overcome this sort of pressure for groupthink also, and to say, no, people have a right to come to complicated conclusions on their own that don't always fit in a political slogan, and to make their own decisions as to when they want to speak on what. And that also goes to what Carl said before. I think that this is very important. It is true. The reason that I love Liberties, and since I'm very proud subscriber and read every issue and every back issue when I got it, it's not because I agree with much of its politics, which I don't often, but it's because of the serious intellectual magazine, and that really thinks about things. And I think it's a sort of these two things that we see are opposed to each other, right? The culture of memes and slogans, and sort of a serious exposition on something. And I think it's something that we need to struggle for. And I think it's a very hard struggle, by the way. It's a very tough struggle in an age of saloons and podcasts but
I also don't agree with everything that we published, but I'm kind of hesitant when we publish something that I disagree with, because I'm like, well, at least they had to back it up. At least this is definitely the best version of this thing that I don't agree with, and I'm proud to be able to publish versions of arguments that I don't agree with, but that are really carefully argued. And then that's it's a good challenge for you to make sure that you believe what you actually believe when you're posed with the best version of the opposing argument. Arash said everything that I wanted to say about, or everything I would have wanted to say about the question of speaking when you don't know what you're talking about what people should say now, who don't know what they're talking about, or who don't have not spent the time that they would have liked to accruing the information that they would need in order to have a knowledgeable view. What I would say is just like, there should just be a blanket policy that everybody should be being really sensitive and nice to their Jewish and Palestinian coworkers and friends. Like, that's not controversial. You don't have to like publicly say it, but that should be, if that could just be the culture in every company and institution right now, even those that don't know anything about this, that would be great. And there should be like a lot of peer pressure to just be like, hey, just don't be a jerk, or just be kind, because we really are totally skinless right now. So yeah, I think it would be helpful.
I think it's a great intervention, sort of him. I always say, I had a thing with one of my Israeli friends to say, you really know who the true people are by how they reacted in this day. How I reacted on October 7th, first of all, was messaging human beings that I know, not because they're pawns in some game, but they're because they're people who are living there and they're affected like we would be, with their friends, with their sisters, with their brothers. And of course, I know people, both Palestinians and Israelis in the region. And of course, this war could spread to others. So I think that's a great impulse to begin to say, this is a conflict that affects human lives. It has many complicated reasons. And one might have this position or the other, but to have a genuine care for human beings on both sides of this, including our colleagues. And I think even though many would say, oh, this is just like a general nice thing to say, I think a lot of good things will result from that. I would say that I read one article once, won't name names, but which sort of matter-of-factly mentioned in the middle of it that, oh, I just realized that I hadn't checked on anyone I knew in the middle of this conflict. I thought that was very telling. I can't imagine how could one I can't imagine that. I just physically can't imagine if there was like a war in Iran. I can't imagine that I would first go on TV and accept op-eds and write things without checking on my uncles, my cousins, my my friends. So I think it's a great impulse to begin like that.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question in the chat that I'll read, and then we're gonna close out. So I'm just gonna read it, and thank you all so much. All right. I wonder if you could give your thoughts on a possible outline of concrete political settlement in the near or far future. In your opinion, is a two-state solution a viable possibility? Will things need to get much worse before getting better? Arash, you want to take it first, and I'll go afterwards?
Absolutely. What is a good session in which, if we don't solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict by the end? I personally do that in every dinner party, so I'm happy to do it here as well. Look, so it's what I said before. There's a lot of so I do not think this conflict is crazy or intractable. I do not think so at all. In fact, I don't think it's even one of the hardest conflicts in the world, if you really want to know, in many ways, even though it's pretty hard. No, I would say that precisely because, as I will try to show now, outline of a settlement is really actually here, and it's not that hard. So about the two-state solution, there's a lot of ideology involved. So to say, oh, the two-state solution is dead, the last nail in the coffin, it's like sort of a thing that both people on the left say, but it's also something that people say and sort of appears to make you very smart, and you're sort of like this cool cynicism you have about the world that, oh, this is over. It's not true. And let me tell you this, there was this very big article written by a few big scholars on in foreign affairs about sort of the end of the two-state solution, I think was the sort of title. You read this article, I love when this happens in media. They basically, no, it's not about the end of the two-state solution, right? So they don't actually say the solution is impossible, because that would mean to say they have another solution. They don't, right? So they don't say, they just say something that is true, which is we have to realize there is a one-state reality right now. Israel is ruling in a way that many, I think, justifiably say with apartheid policies, sort of occupation, right? So you can recognize that this is a reality. But as to how to solve this reality, all these people who say a two-state solution is dead, it's not more dead today than it has ever been. Because those who say the only sort of a reasonable reason they bring to say two-state solution is dead is basically the growth of the settlements in the West Bank. That is a technical problem. If you think this conflict has not been solved because of a technical problem, I think you haven't understood anything about it. The problems on this conflict are to do with political will of the two national communities, right? They're not about whether you can draw a nice border that would exclude some people or not. So I think that it's absolutely solvable. I think if you look at the map of the Geneva Initiative, that would exclude most West Bank settlers, and there are all sorts of creative solutions one could do. The good news is this, and we forget about it, is that in Israel, a large number of people on all sides of the political spectrum have at some point committed to the two-state solution. Now, they haven't really followed this commitment, but they have. As Netanyahu did in his Bar Ilan speech in 2009. In Palestine, the leadership is committed to the two-state solution. In every country in the world, all the governments in the world are committed to the two-state solution. Every Arab state in 2002 in the Arab Peace Initiative committed to the two-state solution. So actually, you have the outline of a solution right there. That Geneva Initiative maps, you can look at it, but yes, you will have a Palestinian state in Gaza and most of the West Bank, and you will have some sort of a capital in Jerusalem. You don't need to divide the city by drawing a line about it. After all, when you declare a city, I don't know if anybody has been to cities that are capitals of two states. I have, Nicosia in Cyprus. Well, that one's actually divided, but Chandigarh in India, it's the capital of both Haryana and Punjab. So there are all sorts of creative ways that is possible to do this. And why do I think so? The possibility is definitely there. It's the declared. It's what would make sense. Two states exist already. A state of Israel and a state of Palestine are recognized by a vast majority of countries in the world. The most people are very clear whether they're Israeli or Palestinians. I know you're I know some have very clever ideas about turning Israel-Palestine into Belgium. Good luck, but the fact of the matter is, no one who is there has actually sort of serious proposals about this. What they do have serious proposals is that they have a strong Israeli identities, strong Palestinian identities, and their practical way of doing it. And as I said, the countries in the region and in the world want it. And what gives me a glimmer of hope? We are in a terrible place. I don't like this phrase of things getting much worse before getting better, but I mean, I guess they're true in a sense, because we are in a terrible abyss. and coming out of this will be difficult. It also has a lot to do with one state in the region who has a declared intention of destroying Israel. That's the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I've written about it. But I would say what gives me hope is this: one thing that Israel wants is recognition in this region. And one thing that the other biggest states in the region, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, they all have, is that they are happy to recognize Israel if it allows the formation of a state of Palestine and ends the brutal occupation over their lives. And I think this impulse is on both sides. And let us not forget, the Hamas attacks were aimed precisely at this process of reconciliation that could have happened between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And let us also not forget that Saudi Arabia is not some sellout state that was happy to push the Palestinians under the bus, as we will say, but actually showed some serious commitments to the Palestinian cause for its own reasons and for its for its own reasons. So I believe actually that it is possible that we will see it in our lifetime. Maybe we don't say global socialism in our lifetime, but we can say end of that conflict in both my lifetime and yours, Celeste, and everybody else's. And that I think the role of states outside this region are also very important. So I think that's why United States, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, other countries can work toward that. And the last thing I'd say is, we should not forget one of the most terrible things that Israelis have done and Israel has done in the last little while is what some have called cakeism. This idea that you could just forget the occupation, that you could come up with fancy terms about shrink it, ignore it. You cannot ignore it. You cannot leave millions of people under stateless conditions and then hope that nothing will happen. Not just because it's immoral, which of course it is, but it's also impractical, that it won't work. But that it is possible to end this conflict. And a lot of those who argue otherwise are doing ideological work. They pretend like they are doing just sort of practical analysis. What they're really doing is ideological warfare of trying to. It's the best best ideological warfare is you put what you want as just the only possible solution. I don't think that's the case, and I think vast majority of people in the region and in Israel and Palestine actually want the same thing, which is to live in their own states. And under their own national identities, and that it's absolutely possible. And I hope that we'll see it. And I have some hope. I have some hope that it's possible to see it, but it would require political changes in Israel and a serious political will on part of Arab states and Palestinians.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Arash said. The way that I think about a solution, and I do think that anybody who says that they know what the solution would look like can draw it on a map right now, is lying. Because I guess I'm less optimistic than you are, in that I think that the people who are going to be able to lead Israel and Palestine towards peace don't exist yet. And what I think needs to be happening, at least on the Palestinian side, I think that there should be a lot of money from America, from outside, going into Palestinian territories, investing really seriously and intelligently in the quality of life of Palestinian children. And the reason that I think that is because right now, I know that if you are growing up in the West Bank or in Gaza, you have no prospects. Your education is abysmal. The qualities of the schools are really, really bad. The wealth is all concentrated within a very small number of families. And it is astonishing how many of the resources that get poured into Palestinian territories don't go to the people who need it the most. And in my opinion, those are the children, because of corruption. And yeah, so there has to be a way, and the Americans, I think, because it is our money, it's a lot of our money, need to find a way to make sure that there are community builders, there are community organizers inside Palestine who aren't or not corrupt, who are really invested in the future of their children. There has to be a way to identify them, and it would be great if there were people working on the region who had actually lived in the region, people in the administration who had actually spent time in Israel and Palestine and actually knew those people and could advise and help from on the ground. I think that needs to be a priority of the current government, because it is true that it is very easy to recruit for terrorist organizations if young people have no prospects. And it is also true that there are terrorist attacks that inflame the Israeli, I mean, first of all, they kill people, which is bad, but they also inflame the Israeli population and make them feel, justified or not, that there is no partner in peace. And I do think that reality allows the extremists on both sides of the border to hold everybody else captive. It is possible to allow to get into the community in a way that allows them to understand that there is a better future and that it really is possible. And if you can get Palestinian children to believe that, if you can invest in them and prove to them that that's possible, that's when I think the real change is going to be. It's going to be inevitable. So that's what I think. Okay, thank you everybody so much. This was so wonderful. Arash, thank you so much. This was lovely. It was good to actually hear your voice and see your face.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Celeste. Toda rabba. Shukran jazilan.